Chapter 11. Startled by Renee's outcry, George let go. His look of surprise quickly turned to one of complete bewilderment. "Hey, what's wrong?" Renee rubbed her arms and shoulders. George had gripped them so tightly they ached. "What's wrong? What's wrong with you?" she demanded, still out of breath, her heart pounding. "Sorry," he said quietly. I really am sorry, Renee." He jumped up and tenderly put a hand on her shoulder. She backed away. "Don't touch me." "I really didn't mean anything," he said, his dark eyes seeking hers. I guess I'm like most actors. I can't stand rejection." She turned away from him. Her lower lip was bleeding from his kiss. "You frightened me. You were like an animal. I didn't mean to be. Please, believe me. You've got to accept my apology. It'll never happen again." "No, it won't," she said angrily. She pulled off his jacket and tossed it at him without meeting his eyes. Then she started running up the hill. The cool night air felt good on her arms. She suddenly wanted to run and keep running forever. "Wait!" he called, taking off after her. "At least let me walk you back." She didn't slow her pace, but he quickly caught up with her. "Please, let me. You've got to accept my apology, Renee. You've got to. I feel terrible." "Apology accepted," she said coldly, and kept running up the hill through the tall, wet grass. He stopped. She looked back a few seconds later to see him standing still in the moonlight, his eyes on her, a twisted frown on his face. A frown of disappointment, of regret, of anger? Renee couldn't tell, and she didn't want to think about it. She had made a mistake. She should never have sneaked out with George. She should never have let him tempt her. She knew he was too intense, too strange, too needy. George wasn't what she needed. Not now, not ever. What she needed, Renee thought as she reached the low dormitory and climbed back into her dark room through the open window. What she needed was a good night's sleep. She stared out into the night. Had George followed her? No, no one was out there. The moon had disappeared behind a thick curtain of clouds, and then it started to rain, large brown drops falling slowly at first. In seconds, it became a downpour. She closed the window, shivering from the cold, her arms covered in goosebumps and aching from George's grasp. She undressed quickly and felt blindly through her trunk until she found the flannel nightshirt she had brought. Julie still hadn't returned. She was probably caught in the downpour with the boy she had sneaked out to meet. The rain pummeled the flat roof of the dorm, creating a deafening, steady roar. Renee hoped that Julie was able to find shelter somewhere out of the storm. She climbed up to the top bunk and slipped into bed, pulling the sheet and wool blanket up to her chin. After a short while, she began to feel warmer. "Sleep, sleep, go to sleep." She tried repeating the word in her mind, but it didn't help. She was wide awake. The scene with George down by the water kept replaying itself in her mind. Again, George pulled her close and began to kiss her. She tried to pull away, to escape from his grip. Pleasure turned to pain. Anticipation turned to fear. She couldn't get over her shock at George's sudden violence. His kiss, it didn't seem like a way of expressing affection or warm feeling. The kiss was hostile. No, more than that. It seemed to be filled with hatred. Or was she making too much of it? George was an emotional guy, after all. Maybe he just got carried away. He certainly was apologetic afterward. He seemed upset and terribly sorry about acting so strangely. Maybe he really did care about her. No one had really cared about her that way for 3 years. She hadn't allowed anyone to get really close to her. Sleep, sleep, go to sleep. She wasn't going to allow George to get close either. She decided she'd try to avoid him for the rest of camp. She'd be polite. She wouldn't be cold to him. But no more walks after lights out. No more heart-to-heart talks. No more kisses. She could feel herself getting sleepy, feel herself begin to drift off. She felt her lip. It was definitely cut. George had cut it with his teeth. Sleep, sleep, go to sleep. It was warm now, warm and cozy. The rain had slowed to a gentle hissing whisper above her on the dorm roof. Quiet, it was getting so quiet. And then she heard the tapping sound on the window. No, she thought, please no. But the tapping repeated, louder, more insistent. 3 loud taps followed by 4 quiet taps. Please no. Wearily, she pushed down the bed covers and climbed down to the floor. Tap, 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 tap. Feeling the anger build quickly, she pulled the window up and with a hard tug. "Bax, what are you doing out there?" He grinned at her. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. His white beard and eyebrows were glistening from the raindrops they had trapped. He was wearing a white crew neck sweater and white sailor pants. The rain and the mist, illuminated by pale moonlight, surrounded him, giving him an unreal quality, as if he were some sort of glowing white spirit. Bax, what do you want? We need to be spontaneous sometimes, he said mysteriously, almost shyly. What? It's raining. She suddenly felt foolish. He was wet enough to know that it was raining. Step outside, he said. It sounded more like an order than a request. What? I can't. I'm not dressed. I'm in a nightshirt. It's so late, Bax. What do you want? He stared at her. He seemed to have a ring of white light all around him. He looked like a big light bulb, all white and shiny. A furry white light bulb, Renee thought, smiling despite her bewilderment at what he was doing outside her window. Step outside. I want to run through the stabbing scene with you. A chill ran down Renee's back. Why did Bax suddenly look so ominous, so threatening? I can't. It's raining, Bax, and it's so late. Come on, Renee, he said, frowning impatiently, the white glow around him brightening. Come out. I want to practice the scene now. I think we need to. Bax, you're frightening me, she admitted. We can't practice the scene. Chip isn't here. He's in the hospital, remember? That's okay. I have a replacement, Bax said in a tone that sounded positively threatening. A replacement? Who? As Renee peered into the darkness, Kenny stepped into view, eerily illuminated by Bax's white glow. Bax's eyes glowed bright yellow, and he gave her an evil, leering grin. He pushed Kenny up to the window. Here, Renee. Stab him. Stab him! No! Renee screamed. No! She awoke and sat straight up in bed, hitting her head on the low ceiling. What an awful nightmare. Her head ached. The rain was still pounding the roof. She glanced down to the window to reassure herself that it was still closed, that it had all been only a nightmare. Which is the worst nightmare, she asked herself, when I'm asleep or when I'm awake? Chapter 12. The next morning began for Renee with an argument with Julie. Renee couldn't quite figure out what the argument was about, why it had started, or why Julie chose to continue it. It had something to do with a pair of Julie's jeans that Renee had worn and had returned to the wrong dresser drawer. Julie, I'm sorry. I didn't know you had any kind of a system, Renee said, standing on Julie's bed to make her own. Oh, I see. I get it. You just think I'm a total slob. Julie snapped. That's not what I said, Renee insisted. She climbed down and faced her friend. She felt uncomfortable since she was dressed from head to foot in another outfit of Julie's. That's what you implied, Julie said, carefully folding the jeans in question. I don't mind lending you my clothes, Renee, but I guess you do mind, Renee said, sounding hurt. Otherwise, I can't imagine why you'd be carrying on like this. It's just the principle, Julie said. What principle? Julie didn't reply. She jammed the jeans into her bottom dresser drawer. Wow, Kevin and I got drenched last night. One minute it was a beautiful night. The next minute it was Noah's Ark time. What did you do? Renee asked, still feeling hurt but delighted to be able to change the subject. We ran into the old boathouse. The roof leaked, but it was better than being outside. Kind of romantic, actually. She gave Renee a sly smile. She seemed to be over her momentary anger. I wonder what's really troubling her, Renee asked herself. It isn't like Julie to make a fuss about where jeans are put away. She is a slob. Renee, how come you still look so tired? Julie asked, suddenly concerned. Because I'm tired, I guess, Renee shrugged. I haven't been sleeping well. She looked out the window. The sun was shining bright and golden over the tall pine trees. I haven't been sleeping at all, actually. I can see that, Julie said, studying her. You look wasted. Thanks a lot, Renee said, annoyed. You sound just like Hetty. Next you'll be telling me I look too awful to go on stage. Renee, stop saying things like that. I'm your friend, remember? And as your friend, I'll say this, and I really mean it as a friend. If being in the play is making you so nervous you can't sleep, you really should quit. It isn't worth losing your health over. Thanks a bunch for the support, Renee said coldly. You know it isn't the play that's got me upset, Julie. It's everything else that's been happening to me here. Julie started to reply, but she was interrupted by a knock on the door. Who is it? She called. George? Julie gave Renee a bewildered look. What does he want? She whispered. Renee didn't feel like telling Julie about the night before. She didn't feel she could confide in Julie anymore. I'm dressed. I'll go see, she said. She walked over to the door and pulled it open halfway. Good morning, George, she said flatly, without any emotion at all. He gave her his best Matt Dillon smile, then looked disappointed when she didn't respond to it. Good morning, Renee, he repeated, almost shyly. How are you this morning? Fine, okay. Well, actually, I didn't sleep too well last night. He looked concerned. Oh, not because of me, I hope. No, not because of you. He stared at her for a long time without saying anything. What do you want, George? she asked impatiently. It's early. We're still getting dressed. Sorry, I ran into Bax this morning and he's sick. What? Julie popped her head out. Bax is sick? She pulled open the door. A couple of girls from other rooms came out into the dark, narrow hall. Yeah, well, he just said he wasn't feeling tip-top. Something he ate or something. He said there won't be a rehearsal until tonight. George smiled at Renee. Guess that means we have a free day. Renee backed up into the room. George followed her in. Julie gave her a surprised look, then headed out to join the other girls on their way to the mess hall. So how about it? George asked when everyone had gone and the dorm was quiet. How about what? Renee asked, annoyed. What was he doing in here when she had already decided not to have any more to do with him? Why was he staring at her so confidently now? Why was he grinning like that? Did he know something she didn't? He looked as if he had something to tell her, something he could hardly keep in another second. What is it, George? She asked wearily, pulling her hands back through her hair, then crossing her arms in front of her. I just thought since we were going to be co-stars in the play, maybe we could spend the day together, go for a swim maybe, do a little rehearsing. Co-stars? Are you for real? What are you talking about? He had just told her his big news, and her only reaction was to get annoyed. It wasn't nice. She wasn't being fair to him, but she realized she didn't care. That's how I happened to see Bax this morning, George explained, dropping down onto Julie's bed and stretching out on his back, putting his hands behind his head. Bax called me into his office first thing. He said Chip was doing okay, but when he gets out of the hospital, he's going home. He isn't coming back to camp, so Bax gave me his role. You? Don't look so shocked. Maybe I'm a real talented guy. But, so how about it? Renee didn't say anything. How about a swim after breakfast? No, she told him, keeping her arms crossed, a protective shield in front of her. I mean, no thanks. He sat up, a hurt expression on his face. Why not? I'm too tired. If we have the whole day off, I want to use it to rest up. Well, come rest with me. He seemed really desperate for her to say yes. She walked over to the dresser so she wouldn't have to meet his pleading eyes. No, I can't, George. Some other time, maybe. You're still bent out of shape about last night, aren't you? His tone was more accusing than apologetic. It made Renee even more determined not to spend time with him. I want to memorize my lines and take a long nap. We're going to be acting together. We should memorize our lines together. We can go down to the dock and... No, George, please. She walked over to the door and opened it wide, an unsettled hint for him to leave. I can't memorize lines that way. I have to be by myself. He looked as if he'd just been mortally wounded. He pulled himself up slowly from the bed and sighed. Listen, Renee, if you change your mind... See you tonight at the rehearsal, she said. She gave him a little wave as he walked past her into the hallway. And stop looking as if someone has just killed your puppy, she called after him. She meant it to sound light, but he didn't turn around or react in any way. When he turned the corner and disappeared from view, she closed the door, breathed a long sigh of relief, and climbed back into bed. Bax didn't look well. His Santa Claus cheeks, normally so rosy, looked pale. His whole face was drawn and lifeless. His gray running suit was wrinkled and had dark brown food stains across the front of the sweatshirt. One of his white high tops was untied. He sat quietly on the edge of the stage, studying his clipboard as everyone wandered into the theater for the evening rehearsal. Occasionally he glanced up to frown at them in greeting. Renee felt rested and a little better prepared to face Bax and the world. She had used the day to nap and to study her lines just as she had told George. An express package from home had brought her a new shipment of clothes. Being able to wear her own jeans and sweater made her feel more comfortable too. So when Hetty began the evening by insulting Renee at the entrance to the theater, Renee took it in stride and didn't react with shock or anger or embarrassment the way Hetty would have liked. Let me get the door for you. You look so exhausted, Hetty had said, stepping past Renee to pull open the heavy wooden door to the theater. Thanks, Renee said, walking quickly through the open door without a glance at Hetty. Hetty followed close behind, determined to rile Renee. At this rate, you'll never make it to opening night. Why not save yourself a lot of anxiety and unhappiness and let me take over the role now? Renee spun around. Hetty, all the tricks in the world won't get me to give up this role. Tricks? What tricks? Hetty couldn't hide the fact that she was pleased she was able to get a reaction from Renee. You and I both know what I'm talking about, Renee said, her voice calm and controlled. You're losing it, Renee, Hetty said quietly, shaking her head in mock sadness. You're really losing it. You need a long rest somewhere far away. Renee turned without replying and headed down the aisle. I don't need tricks to get that role. I have talent, Hetty called after her. Renee ignored her and took a seat in the second row. I'm not going to let her see me as vulnerable again. Renee thought, I can be as strong as she is, even stronger. Even though it was the middle of summer, the theater was cold and damp. Renee began to get a nervous feeling in the pit of her stomach. She knew she'd be up on the stage soon, having to prove herself again and again, having to show Hetty and Bax and all the rest of them that she deserved to have the lead in the play. After a while, Bax struggled to his feet and raised his clipboard above his head for silence. People, people, he called out. His voice sounded weak. His words didn't echo off the high rafters the way they usually did. Sorry to interrupt your summer fun for a little theater work. The auditorium quickly grew silent. Bax was speaking so quietly everyone had to strain to hear what he was saying. He doesn't really look sick, Renee thought. He seems completely bummed out, completely dispirited. I regret to say that I am feeling more than a little bit like King Lear this evening, Bax said wearily, not even bothering to do his usual pacing back and forth across the stage. I'm feeling ready to give away my kingdom. The only problem is, of course, that I do not possess a kingdom, so I suppose we shall have to proceed with our work here. He paused for a long while, staring straight ahead toward the back of the small theater. The clipboard slipped out of his hand and clattered to the floor of the stage. He didn't bother to retrieve it. Before we return to our scenes and curtains, I want to talk a little bit about fear, Bax said, trying unsuccessfully to clear his throat as he talked. Curtains, as you may have figured out by now, is about fear. It's about different kinds of fear, actually. The fear of losing control, the fear of consequences of losing control, the fear of dying suddenly, of being murdered by someone who has lost control. Curtains is about fear. And I believe the theater itself is about fear. I know that I personally have been largely motivated by fear. Fear of not getting backers for a show, fear of failure, of embarrassment, fear of bad reviews. I confess to you that I use fear when working with you, when trying to mold you into actors and actresses fit to perform in front of the most discerning audience. Fear of ridicule, fear of my disapproval, fear of appearing foolish in front of your peers. I use all of these fears in motivating you to find your character, to find your talent, and to do your best work. Tonight I'm asking you to find the fear within yourself, to find the fear you need to perform your role to the very utmost of your ability. We all have fear within us, he said, stepping so close to the lip of the stage that the toes of his sneakers protruded over the edge. The question is, how do we locate the fear? How do we bring it forward? How do we use it? Bax's lecture seemed to exhaust him. His shoulders slumped forward and he sighed. He pulled out a large blue polka dot handkerchief and mopped his forehead. What a strange speech, Renee thought, checking to see if the other cast members felt as uncomfortable as she did. Why does he think he has to use fear to motivate us? Why not use encouragement, enthusiasm, support? There's enough fear in just getting up on the stage, she thought. Wouldn't everyone get a better performance? Wouldn't I give a better performance if he showed me how to lessen the fear instead of increasing it? She didn't have time to think about it any longer. Bax called George and her to the stage to run through the stabbing scene. Renee had entered the theater feeling rested, more fit, and ready to face the challenges that awaited her on stage, but after Hetty's renewed attacks and Bax's lecture, she was beginning to regret leaving her dorm room. All of her doubts and inhibitions came back, and seeing the knife on the table, the knife she would have to pick up and use again, plunged her back to the whole horrible scene with Chip, plunged her back to one scene of blood and then another, and she was overcome with dread. All of her good feelings, all of her renewed strength abandoned her as she stepped onto the stage and faced the smiling George. She felt like an observer as she ran through the scene. It was as if she were in the auditorium, watching from the third row, watching someone else speak the lines and go through the motions that ended in the collapsible knife sliding between George's ribs. Was she performing well? Was she finding the fear Bax had requested? Was she getting across the intensity, the fury of a person so out of control as to be able to thrust a knife into another person? She couldn't tell. She was just going through it, playing a part, unable to concentrate, unable to clear her mind enough to let the character take over. Stop. Please stop, Bax said sorrowfully. I can't bear this any longer. What? What was he saying? Renee held the knife in her hand, gripping it so tightly it hurt. Was he stopping the scene? Was he about to criticize her again, to scream at her, to try to make her even more fearful than she already was? I can't do this anymore. Bax cried, his voice weak and tired. He heaved the clipboard across the stage. It hit the curtain and slid down the floor. I'm wasting my life on amateurs with no desire. He complained to no one in particular, to everyone. I'm wasting my energy, my being, my talents, my life. I can't. I'm sorry, but I just can't put myself through this charade any longer. Suddenly, all the lights in the theater went out. A few kids cried out in surprise. Then there was silence. Renee sat down on the couch on the stage. Where was George? She didn't know. Bax, what happened? Is it a fuse? A boy called out. Bax didn't reply. Renee heard a scraping sound like a chair being dragged across the stage. She heard footsteps, shuffling noises. Is anyone going to do anything? She heard Hetty shout from the back of the theater. Bax, is it a power failure? Another girl asked. Bax? No reply. Let's not panic, everyone, George said suddenly. He was somewhere across the stage from Renee. If the lights don't come back on, we can easily make our way out of the theater. Bax, should we leave? Renee heard Julie call. No reply. The main thing is to stay calm, George said. Suddenly the lights blinked brightly, then stayed on. Renee was the first to see it. It was just a few feet away from her, something large, something gray, swinging to and fro just off the floor. She didn't scream. She was too horrified to scream when she realized it was Bax. At first, no one screamed. No one made a sound. They saw the light cable swung over a rafter, and they saw the large gray body, its neck bent at such an odd angle, attached to the cable. No one believed it. No one could believe that Bax had done it, had hanged himself right in front of them.